We continue reading the book of Sirach today. Wisdom literature was not just a theological or theoretical thing for the author, but it was a very practical thing. The reality of life is that we suffer, and he talks about human suffering. There he says there will be suffering, but he encourages them all to study the generations long past and understand, has anyone hoped in the Lord and been disappointed? When he was speaking of the generations of the past, he's speaking of Abraham and Isaac and Moses and Elijah, and to remember that they suffered, but they continued to trust and hope in the Lord, and they weren't disappointed. You and I have a greater vantage point because we can look back not only at the figures of the Old Testament, but at Jesus Christ himself. We read in the gospel today that he's teaching his disciples that he would have to be turned over to men who will kill him. He will suffer and die. But then he adds that I will be raised up on the third day. And so we see that Jesus placed his absolute trust in the Lord. There was nobody who suffered more intensely, physically or spiritually, than Jesus did when he, in his passion on the cross. We have the Stations of the Cross that we celebrate every Lent because we want to understand more fully what Jesus experienced in his suffering. But the good news of the gospel is that beyond that suffering, there's eternal life. Jesus went from suffering to joy. He went from death to life. And we do the same thing. We go from death to life, eternal life. And that's what the book of Sirach is encouraging. And for us, we have an even fuller understanding of that in our time. Last night I went to Rayanne Nursing Home about 9:30 to anoint Bonnie Oakley, who's very near death. And looking at her tired and frail body, and I thought the world would look at her and say, she's just disintegrating away. But with the eyes of faith, I thought this is the greatest moment of her life, because receiving the sacraments of the church, she was about to close her eyes and open them up to see God. And that's where our faith is. That's why we can have hope and trust, that we can accept those things and realize that, as I said yesterday, the book of Sirach tells us that we will all die, but death does not have the last word. We will rise again one day, just as Jesus promised. Let us stand and offer our prayers and petitions.